Elliot's latest book, by the way, if you haven't seen it, Tested by Zion, the Bush administration, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Dennis Ross, who served as special assistant to President Obama, among many positions over many years in the Middle East peace process. Now, he doesn't have a book that's just published. He has a book that will publish, and after all, I think equity is necessary here. So it is entitled, or will be entitled, see if I got this right, Doomed to Succeed, U.S.-Israeli Relations During a Time of Change, right?
Yep.
Okay, we'll sign up for it now. Let me ask you both, you heard what the ambassador had to say in his survey of the region. Talks with Iran underway right now, anticipation of President Obama's trip. Response?
Well, I think that he framed the trip very much the way I think it is seen not only by the United States but also by Israel. I think it is a time for a new beginning. I think it's a time to send a message. I think one of the points he made at the end is very important to keep in mind. We're in a period of enormous, unprecedented upheaval in the Middle East. There's one country for all of its changes internally. The reality is it is a democracy, and it is stable, and it is always going to be an American friend. If you're looking for one pillar in the Middle East during a time of change, it's Israel.
And no real expression of optimism expressed over the talks with Iran.
No, look, I think it's great that the president is going. Israel's a close ally, just as any president should go to Canada or Japan. He should go to Israel. I think his challenge is to persuade Israelis that deep down, he understands them and the challenges they face. He's going to need to show a kind of delicate medical procedure was conducted here, a Kishka transplant.
You want to talk about that some more?
I think that's the challenge for the president, and I think it's unfortunate in that sense that he didn't do this in 2009, because it's harder now in 2013. But I think it's terrific that he's going to Israel.
Dennis, you advise the president. What's your take on that? Some convincing to do here?
Well, I think there's always a convincing to do in truth. I mean, the fact is, particularly now, if you're sitting in Israel and you're looking at what's going on around you, this is a time of enormous uncertainty. It's a time of unprecedented challenge. And I think that, from the standpoint of the Israeli public, having the American president come, having this American president come as the first trip of his second term, it actually does create an opportunity. I think what Michael said is exactly right. It creates an opportunity. It creates an opportunity not only for a new beginning between the president of the second term and the Prime Minister of Israel, who is beginning a new term, assuming he puts together a government, which I think he will. But I think it also is a chance to create a connection with the Israeli public and to demonstrate unmistakably, when the president says that he's determined to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons, he isn't saying that from a distance. It's not an abstraction. He can go and he can address the Israeli public directly. When talking about a common interest that we have in terms of what's going on in Syria, even I would say common interest as it relates to the Palestinians. It's not just the issue of trying to preserve two states. There's a common strategic interest in preserving the Palestinian Authority so that the future identity of the Palestinians isn't an Islamist one.
You have both mentioned the enormous upheaval in the region. The Arab Spring obviously continues to ripple on. So let's go country by country. We can call it a little bit of a lightning round here because there's so much to cover. Let me start, excuse me, with Iran, with the talks that have been underway. As you saw, I asked the ambassador about conflicting signals coming from Iran. How do you size them up?
I worry about what I've seen in the newspapers, because it seems to me that there is a weakening of the P5+1 conditions.
There appeared to be some offer to drop this oil for gold business.
Right. It looks to me as if we're negotiating with ourselves. We've seen no concessions on the part of Iran. So we make an offer, they don't accept it, or they walk away. Months go by, we make another offer, a better offer. The message to Iran, I think, is just wait. And meanwhile, of course, they do get closer and closer and closer in their nuclear weapons program, on the missile side, on the warhead side, and on having more enriched uranium.
Play for time?
Well, I think the Iranians have been playing a rope-a-dope strategy. There's no doubt about that. I think the question is, did the P5+1 approach this negotiation from the standpoint of trying to deny the Iranians an excuse? If the Iranian excuse is, you're not offering us anything when you're asking us to give something, maybe trying to deny an excuse is something that could work. the question is, if you're denying an excuse and the Iranians don't respond right now, then I think the posture on the 5+1 has to be, all right, we are beginning to lose patience now, and the 5+1 may have to begin to shape a timetable to say when diplomacy no longer is working.
Here's a quote from a Western diplomat, unidentified, or from a diplomat. This was more constructive and more positive than previous meetings because they were really focusing on the proposal on the table. What are we hearing?
Well, I think the Iranians have a strong interest to portray this positively.
I mean, maybe that was an Iranian...
It was Salehi. No, it was, yes. I think the foreign minister of Iran talked about this being very positive.
No, he called it a turning point.
Jalili described it as a turning point, who was their negotiator. But I think the more interesting thing is that they listened and offered nothing. Now, the 5+1, as I said, if they're taking away excuses, that's fine. In the next round, then you say, all right, you didn't come with anything, now you're revealing yourselves. At some point, the negotiations have got to focus on clarifying, is diplomacy going to work or not? One of the reasons I've been in favor not of a step-by-step approach, because I think it plays to the Iranian instinct of playing for time, is to go to an endgame proposal that sort of says, look, you say you want civil nuclear power, here's a definition of civil nuclear power, you can have it. If you're not prepared to accept it, then we know diplomacy isn't going to work. If you are prepared to accept it, then we know we have a deal.
Elliot Abrams,
it's time to clarify.
Elliot, in the New York Times today, seized Chinese weapons raised concern on Iran capture a vessel off Yemen alarms region. What's going on?
Well, Iran is continuing to build up not only its nuclear program, but its allies in Hezbollah and in Syria. We know that Iranian Revolutionary Guards forces are in Syria, small numbers. We've seen reports. You still read the New York Times?
I read everything.
Okay. Some excuse.
I have a quote from Haaretz here, too, so if
okay.
you'd like me to...
Full service.
We've seen, we know that Hezbollah fighters are backing up the Assad army in Syria. So we see Russia and China playing this game. Meanwhile, of course, if you look at the P5+1, who are they? You've got Russia and China in that group. I'm afraid that the person whose Iranian nuclear policy has been successful for about a dozen years now is the Ayatollah Khamenei. He's doing great. We're not. They get closer and closer and closer every year to a nuclear weapons capability. We have a sanctions program that is damaging the Iranian economy. And if our goal were to damage the Iranian economy and raise the price of foreign cars in Iran, it would be a great success. The goal, though, is to prevent them from getting closer to a nuclear weapon, and we're failing to do that.
Dennis, very quick question on Iran. You advised Barack Obama, the president is going to Israel. Do you expect anything definitive from this trip on the subject of Iran in these negotiations?
Well, whatever might be definitive will not be out in public. You're going to have the president and the prime minister talk about Iran. I suspect that in their private conversations, they will focus a good deal on the meaning of prevention and what's the point at which prevention as an objective could be lost. Neither side, not the president, not the prime minister, wants to make a kind of commitment that so ties their own hands in terms of what they do that they're limited in terms of the future. But I think they do want to have more of an understanding between each other, not only on the assessment of where the Iranian program is, where I would say there's no gap between the two sides, but more of a sense of what's the point where prevention as an objective begins to lose its meaning, because that's the point where if diplomacy hasn't worked, then force becomes inevitable.
All right, just a few minutes left, so back to the lightning round that hasn't been so lightning, because this is complex stuff. But to Syria, 70,000 dead, something like 1 million displaced. Is there an end game for Assad in this?
Well, I think for Assad, the only end game is he leaves. There's no other end game than Assad leaving. The real question is, what has to be done, A, to accelerate his departure, B, to try to produce a transition that doesn't yield a failed state that's totally disintegrated, that gives al-Qaeda and jihadists all sorts of access, and C, what do we do to try to influence that landscape?
You want to take on A, B, and C?
Well, I agree. That's what we should be doing. I think it's tragic, frankly, that we have been so slow in responding. Iran has not been slow. Hezbollah has not been slow. Secretary of State Kerry announced last week that we would henceforth be giving our humanitarian aid to the opposition to strengthen it. I think that's terrific, and I think the fact that it happened so early in his tenure as Secretary of State is a good sign, but think about it for a minute. February 2013, we've given hundreds of millions of dollars of humanitarian aid to Syria, and guess what? It has gone through the Assad regime. It's gone largely through the Syrian Red Crescent, which is controlled by the regime, and Doctors Without Borders reported in late January that there's much, much more humanitarian aid available in the government-controlled areas than in the opposition-controlled areas. It's incredible that it has taken us until February 2013 to make that switch. I just hope it isn't too late to strengthen the more moderate forces among the Syrian opposition against the, let's say, the extremist or jihadi forces.
I agree with that point. I mean, the fact is that the administration has given about $360 million in humanitarian assistance. It does it through the UN. The UN has been working through the regime and through regime-controlled organizations until a week ago. And the fact is,
why did it take so long?
They were focused on, I think, the UN was focused on the kind of circumstances, legal circumstances under which it provides assistance. And I think that has to change. I think it's very good that, as Elliot said, Secretary Kerry is focused on how you do things differently. My own view, and it has been this way for some time, we have got to provide lethal assistance, because if you're going to influence the realities on the ground, you have to basically affect the balance of forces among the opposition. You can't do that only through non-lethal assistance.
Let me move you on. You both mentioned Secretary Kerry. Let's go to Egypt now for a moment. In his visit there, he was leaning on Egypt for serious economic and political reforms. What's the outlook? What do you look to be happening?
Well, I think that there's a huge challenge in Egypt, because if the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't improve its approach to governance, you're going to see increasing instability. One of the things that has surprised me is not that they would seek control, that was obvious, but I thought that they would be smart enough to realize that it was in their interest to be more inclusive, because if they're not inclusive, their ability to govern is going to be very limited. They're not going to be able to deliver. You know, Egypt's economy is sinking, and if they don't deliver on this score, their own capacity to remain in power will be in question. So I think one of the things that Secretary Kerry is trying to do is to forge more of a consensus within Egypt on what they will do about the economy. That's obviously a starting point.
Elliot, what's your big picture view of Egypt and the implications for America, Israel, and the broader region?
You know, we can't save the Egyptians from themselves. The problem I think, is I would anyway, like to see the Muslim Brotherhood fail, but I wouldn't like to see Egypt fail. We certainly don't want chaos in Egypt. I agree completely with Dennis. The Morsi and the Brotherhood are governing as if they had just won an election with 99% of the votes. They won 51-48, but they're disregarding the rest of the Egyptians, people who don't really want a Brotherhood government. So as long as they consider that, first of all, we don't have enough money to continue to bail them out. This is not, a little Tunisia. The World Bank IMF can give them $4 billion. Okay, that's a month or two. That's all, and that's all it buys you. I think unless this government of Egypt changes the way it's governing, I don't think it'll be there a year or two from now.
With even more implications for the region.
With implications of
I want to get to another place before we're out of time.
We don't have an interest in Egypt being a failed state, because it'll radiate outwards. But the fact of the matter is, we need to maintain a set of principles that are also practicalities as it relates to Egypt. At the end of the day, the Muslim Brotherhood needs to observe its international obligations, meaning peace with Israel, or it's not going to get help from the outside. It needs to respect minority rights, so if all the Coptic Christians begin to flow, you're not going to get help or investment from the outside. It needs to maintain political pluralism, or you're not going to have stability on the inside. These are all practicalities. They also fit our principles.
Let me ask you both, because this is a stop we have to make and before we wrap up here, and that's the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Do you expect some kind of reconciliation between Abbas and Hamas?
Well, by my count, we've had, I think, 5 reconciliation agreements so far, and obviously none of them have happened. That's not an accident. The reason they don't reconcile is not because they're not under pressure from the Palestinian public that would like to see the Palestinian community, the Palestinian politically entity unified. It's because they're real rivals. Now, the fact is, Michael Warren said it correctly. As long as Hamas doesn't meet the quartet's conditions, it can't be a partner. I'm hoping that what we will see is an effort on the part of the Palestinian Authority to focus on how it can actually begin to achieve things with the Israelis and not how it can try to reconcile with Hamas.
Elliot, last question to you. A rocket from Gaza hit Israel last week.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's been very quiet since November. What's going on in Gaza? What do you think Hamas is thinking?
I think Hamas is trying to figure out ways of getting into the Palestinian Authority government and, big point for them historically, getting into the PLO, which they've never been in and which actually Arafat kept them out of. My fear is that we're going to see people, starting with the Europeans, deserting those quartet principles. My own conversations with the Europeans suggest to me that at the first show of leg on the part of Hamas, they'll start compromising. Ambassador Oren said rightly that Israel would not negotiate with Hamas. I am not so sure that the Europeans won't be negotiating with Hamas and trying to bring about a coalition between Hamas and Fatah that, if it happens, is going to make peace negotiations impossible.
I'm going to be terribly nasty to both of you, and I'll give you each one last question, one last response. You get one sentence.
Okay.
Looking forward over the next few weeks and months, one prediction or one big thing you're looking for from the region. Dennis?
I think the focus has to, in the immediate term, is on Syria, and I think the key here is a greater degree of activism to ensure that, in fact, we try to affect the landscape there.
I agree with that. On Syria, I would say you will see perhaps an agreement between Hamas and Fatah on paper. It will never be implemented, and it will break up once again. But while it exists, it will make any progress on negotiation connected with the president's trip impossible.
Elliot Abrams, Dennis Ross, thank you for your insight and for all that you have done. Ladies and gentlemen, please give them a big hand. Thank you for joining us this morning. Have a great conference. Enjoy the show.
I think I know.